It was just a portrait of a mother and her daughters, hanging quietly on the living room wall, unnoticed by most visitors. People passed by it every day, sometimes pausing for a second, sometimes not at all. At first glance, it looked ordinary: warm smiles, soft lighting, a sense of family frozen in time. The mother stood in the center, calm and composed, while her two daughters leaned slightly toward her, as if seeking comfort. Nothing about the scene seemed unusual, yet something about the image felt wrong, though it was difficult to explain. The longer one stared at it, the more an uncomfortable feeling crept in, subtle and persistent, like a whisper you could almost hear but never fully understand. The mother's name was Eleanor, and the daughters were Lucy and Anne. The portrait had been taken years ago, shortly after they moved into the house. Eleanor remembered the day clearly, the photographer adjusting the lights, the girls standing still with forced patience, the momentary smiles captured on command. She had approved the photo without hesitation. It represented stability after a difficult time in their lives. But now, whenever Eleanor walked past it, she avoided looking too closely. Her eyes always drifted away, as if something inside her warned her not to stare. She couldn't say why. It was only a photograph after all. Still, her chest tightened every time she passed it, and she never understood the reason. One evening, while cleaning the living room, Eleanor stopped in front of the portrait longer than usual. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that settles after midnight. She tilted her head slightly and noticed something she had never paid attention to before: the hands. Her hands were resting gently on her daughter's shoulders, but the position felt odd. The fingers looked too long, the angles unnatural. Lucy's hands hung at her sides, stiff and straight, while Anne's were clasped together, fingers interlocked tightly. Eleanor leaned closer, feeling a strange chill. She couldn't remember posing that way. The realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She told herself it was nothing, just perspective, poor lighting, or maybe her tired eyes playing tricks on her. Still, once she noticed the hands, she couldn't stop seeing them. Every detail stood out now. The knuckles appeared sharper than normal. The shadows between the fingers looked deeper, darker. Eleanor stepped back, her heart beating faster than it should. The smiles in the portrait suddenly felt forced, almost strained. She turned away and finished cleaning, but the image followed her thoughts. That night, she dreamed of hands pressing against glass, fingers stretching, searching for something just out of reach. The next morning, Eleanor woke with the uneasy feeling still clinging to her. Sunlight filled the living room, softening everything it touched. In daylight, the portrait looked normal again. Relieved, Eleanor laughed quietly at herself. She blamed stress, lack of sleep, and moved on with her day. Lucy and Anne ate breakfast at the table, chatting about school, unaware of their mother's lingering unease. Yet when Eleanor glanced at them, her eyes went instinctively to their hands. Lucy's fingers tapped rhythmically on the table. Anne twisted her hands together, perfectly normal. And yet, the discomfort returned, faint but unmistakable. Days passed, and Eleanor tried to ignore the portrait. She avoided standing in front of it and kept herself busy. But small things began to change. One afternoon, she noticed faint smudge marks on the glass covering the photo. Thin streaks like fingerprints. She wiped them away with a cloth, feeling foolish for being unsettled. Still, she wondered how they got there. No one touched the portrait. That night, she stood in the hallway and stared at it from a distance. The hand seemed closer to the surface now, almost raised. Eleanor swallowed hard, telling herself she was imagining things. Lucy was the first to say something. "Mom," she asked one evening, her voice hesitant, "do you remember how we stood for the picture?" Eleanor looked up, surprised. "Of course," she replied, though she wasn't sure. Lucy frowned. "I don't remember holding my hands like that." Anne stayed silent, staring down at her plate. Eleanor felt a cold wave pass through her. She laughed lightly, trying to ease the tension. "Pictures can be funny like that," she said. But Lucy wasn't convinced. "They don't feel like my hands," she whispered. The words lingered in the air, heavy and unsettling. That night, Eleanor dreamed again. She stood in front of the portrait, but the glass was gone. The figures inside stared back at her, unmoving. Slowly their hands began to move, fingers bent at impossible angles stretching outward. Eleanor tried to scream but couldn't. She woke up gasping, her heart racing. The house was silent. She got out of bed and walked to the living room, drawn by something she couldn't resist. The portrait looked unchanged, but the air around it felt thick. Eleanor raised her hand, hesitating, then touched the glass. It was warm. She pulled her hand back in shock. Glass wasn't supposed to be warm. Her breath came shallow as she leaned closer. The hands in the portrait were clearer now, more detailed. She could see lines in the skin, faint creases, nails pressed against the surface. Eleanor's mind raced. This wasn't possible. She considered taking the portrait down, hiding it somewhere, but fear held her still. A strange sense of guilt washed over her, unexplainable yet overwhelming. She whispered an apology without knowing why. The warmth faded slightly, but the feeling of being watched did not. Over the following days, Lucy and Anne grew quieter. They spent more time in their rooms, avoiding the living room altogether. Eleanor noticed changes in their behavior. Lucy flexed her fingers often, as if they hurt. Anne wore long sleeves, even in warm weather. One afternoon, Eleanor gently took Anne's hands and examined them. The skin looked pale, the veins more visible. Anne pulled away quickly. "Don't," she said softly. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked. Anne didn't answer. She just glanced toward the living room wall and shook her head. Eleanor finally decided to take the portrait down. She waited until the girls were asleep. Standing on a chair, she lifted the frame carefully. As soon as it came off the wall, she felt resistance, like something pulling back. Her arms trembled, but she didn't let go. When the frame finally came free, the wall behind it was marked with faint handprints pressed into the paint. Eleanor froze. They were small, child-sized, and one larger set in the center. Her stomach turned. She carried the portrait to the storage room, her hands shaking, and leaned it against the wall, covering it with a cloth. That night, the house felt different, heavier. Eleanor lay awake, listening. Around 3 a.m., she heard a soft tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It came from the storage room. Her heart pounded as she forced herself out of bed. The tapping grew louder as she approached. She opened the door slowly. The cloth had slipped off the portrait. The glass was covered in handprint. Now, layered and frantic. Eleanor stepped back, terrified. A faint outline of hands pressed outward from inside the image, as if trying to escape. A whisper filled the room, barely audible. Eleanor couldn't make out the words, but she understood the emotion behind them. Anger, longing, betrayal. Memories she had buried deep began to surface. Moments she had chosen to forget. A choice she had made years ago before Lucy and Anne were born. A child she never allowed herself to remember. Eleanor collapsed to the floor, sobbing. The portrait seemed to pulse, the hands moving in slow, desperate motions. "I'm sorry," she cried. "I didn't know what else to do." The whispers grew softer, but the hands remained. The next morning, Eleanor found Lucy and Anne sitting quietly at the kitchen table. Their hands rested flat on the surface, fingers spread. Eleanor noticed faint red marks around their wrists, like pressure marks. "Did you hear anything last night?" she asked gently. Lucy nodded. Anne looked up, her eyes tired. "It's been trying to get back," Anne said. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. "What has?" she asked, though she already knew. Anne glanced at Lucy, then back at her mother. "The one you left behind," she whispered. Eleanor didn't deny it. The truth finally spilled out in broken sentences and tears. She told them about the child she had lost, the decision she had made out of fear and desperation. She admitted how she had buried the memory, pretending it never existed. She spoke. The air in the room felt lighter, as if a weight was lifting. Lucy reached out and took Eleanor's hand. "It just wanted to be seen," she said softly. Anne nodded and remembered. Eleanor sobbed, holding her daughters close, feeling both shame and relief. They returned to the storage room together. The portrait stood against the wall, silent now. Eleanor uncovered it slowly. The image had changed. The hands were still, resting naturally. There were now 3 children in the photo, standing beside Eleanor, their small hands touching hers. Eleanor gasped, tears streaming down her face. The glass felt cool again. No warmth, no movement, just stillness. She understood then that some things never truly disappear. They wait, patient and persistent, until they are acknowledged. The portrait was no longer frightening, it was a reminder. The portrait now hangs in the living room once more. Visitors still see only a mother and her daughters. They smile, admire it briefly, and move on. But sometimes someone pauses a little longer than usual. Their eyes drift downward, lingering on the hands. A strange feeling settles over them, one they can't quite explain. Eleanor notices when that happens. She doesn't say anything, she just watches quietly, her own hands folded calmly in front of her, knowing that some stories are told without words, and some truths reveal themselves only to those who look closely enough.